Okay, and we're going to get started now. So thank you, everyone. Greetings. I'm David Bilchitz, professor at the University of Johannesburg and also director of the South African Institute for Advanced Constitutional Public Human Rights and International Law, long name in short SAIFAC. We're delighted to be hosting the seminar on Black Lives Matter and police brutality. Where to from here? I suppose I said delighted. I wish we didn't have to host the seminar, but nevertheless, it is a really important discussion to have. We have a fantastic panel, and we're very grateful to our panelists. I'm going to hand over to Rebecca Rattner, who has co-organized the seminar with me, who's a visiting research fellow at SAIFAC, and Rebecca will be chairing, and we look forward to an excellent discussion tonight. Rebecca, over to you.
Thank you, David. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this seminar today on Black Lives Matter and police brutality, hosted by SAIFAC and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. We're very happy to have you join us and our excellent panelists for this important and timely discussion. Systemic racism and police brutality have been ongoing problems in the United States that have remained largely unaddressed despite greater attention to the issue in recent years, particularly since the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2013. Police brutality connected to discriminatory attitudes is also a problem outside of the US, including in South Africa, where there is a long history of brutality by security forces. While lack of adequate accountability has continued to be pervasive in both the US and South Africa, developments in the past few months may have created a new opportunity. The May 25th murder of George Floyd, a 46-year-old Black man, by white police officers in Minneapolis sparked major worldwide protests over racism and police brutality. Just this week, Jacob Blake, a 29-year-old Black man, was shot 7 times in the back in front of his 3 children by police in Wisconsin, reigniting protests. In the United States, many Black Lives Matter activists argue that true change requires the fundamental dismantling of the structures of systemic racism. In South Africa, these calls require examining not only structures of race, but also attitudes towards other excluded groups, such as non-South Africans. The killing of Collins Kosa by the Defense Force early on in the lockdown surrounding the coronavirus created shocks across the community. We have an excellent panel presenting today to discuss these issues in both countries and explore the ongoing debate about how to address this problem. Matthew Clair is a professor of sociology at Stanford University, whose research focuses include law and society, race and ethnicity, social inequality, and criminal justice. His book, Privilege and Punishment, shows how race and class inequalities in the criminal legal system are embedded and reproduced through the attorney-client relationship, revealing a paradox of legal control. Striving to exercise one's legal rights often backfires for the poor and people of color. Professor Clair has received awards from the American Sociological Association, the Law and Society Association, and the Society for the Study of Social Problems, amongst others. And his research has contributed to policy reports on reducing racialized mass incarceration and improving the health of racial and ethnic minorities. Jonny Steinberg is outgoing professor of African Studies at Oxford University, and from next year, he will be teaching part-time at Yale University. His work explores South African people and institutions in the wake of the transition to democracy, investigating how the political transition has changed the filigrees of unwritten rules through which individuals understand their lives and relate to others. He is the author of several books on everyday life in the wake of South Africa's transition to democracy. Among them are A Man of Good Hope, which charts the odyssey of a Somali refugee moving through South Africa, and The Number, A History of Crime and Punishment in South Africa. His book, Thin Blue, explores the unwritten rules of policing in South Africa based on time he spent embedded with police, exploring the relationship between South Africa's citizens and its new police force. Ottilia Anna Maunganidze is the head of special projects at the Institute for Security Studies and leads in informing institutional strategy on emerging threats and collaborative action. Her work focuses on peace, justice, international criminal law, migration, and security. She has published articles on the conflation of law and politics and the functioning of the International Criminal Court. Ms. Maunganidze joined ISS in 2009, prior to which she was a legal advisor and human rights education officer. Our discussion today will start with a 15-minute presentation by each of our speakers, followed by a 30-minute Q&A session, and then a short conclusion. During the Q&A, people are invited to post questions about the presentations through Zoom and/or their names if they would like to speak verbally. Unless called upon to speak, we ask that everyone please turn their video off and remain on mute. I'd now like to invite Henning Sir, the resident representative of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in South Africa, to say a few words, and then we'll get started with Professor Clair's presentation, followed by Professor Steinberg, and concluding with Ms. Maunganidze. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and thanks David and the team of SAIFAC for partnering for this event. A warm welcome to everyone, and especially to our three very distinguished panelists. The Konrad Adenauer Foundation is a German political foundation, and its roots, it started after the Second World War in political education. That is our core work, and actually that is also the reason why I didn't hesitate long to partner with this event, because I think it's very important. We as a German organization are dedicated very much to overcoming the wounds of the past when it comes to the German history. And actually it makes me a little bit sad that the topic of police brutality and systemic racism is still a topic after how many years? 80 years after the 75 years after the Second World War, where actually a war which took place because of racist ideology by the Germans, that this is still a topic nowadays. So today we are talking about the police brutality and systemic racism in the US and in South Africa. And as Rebecca pointed out, there have been recent events which raised much more awareness about this topic in both countries. But actually, and this is also a very sad thing, those events are nothing new. There had been repetitively cases of police brutality with racial motives in both countries for years. And despite the fact that both countries are very different in many aspects, they share certain things. And this worth it that we have a look at specifically the US and in South Africa. If I may point out to some of them, they have in common that both countries had been predominantly English colonies with large amounts of European settlers seeking to possess and cultivate land. And the use of force was very common during colonial times, during a long history. And it seems that both countries, until the present day, that there is violence, a high level of violence, and the existence of a certain gun culture, which is still prevailing. The US and South Africa share a history with difficult and complex race relations among its citizens. In both countries, there had been laws codifying the segregation on the basis of skin color. In the US, it was the civil rights movement in the 1960s, which demanded a change, while in South Africa, there were the liberation movements, which fought successfully for freedom. And despite the fact that on the paper, there should be equal rights nowadays, it seems that the state, in this case, the police, is not treating all its citizens equally. Apparently, history is still in the head of the people, which is tainting the present days. This one can observe in the fact that even in US social sciences, it is common to distinguish between black, white, Asian, and Hispanic. While in South Africa, they follow the old apartheid categories by separating people into black, white, colored, and Indian, mostly. Now I'm simplifying here. While in European social sciences, for instance, the analysis of society takes more place regarding the nationality or the migration background of the people. And in Latin America, for instance, social sciences is analyzing the society much more on the basis of the different economic status. But in the US and South Africa, the racial cleavage is still the defining criteria to explain society. And I assume this is especially due to their particular history, which they have in common. Apparently, equality cannot be guaranteed by simply stipulating it in a constitution. There is much more than that. We also have to live those principles and values, and the state has a special obligation to follow them, given the fact that it has the monopoly on applying force. As the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, we are happy to partner with SAIFAC for this event, and we hope that these kinds of debates contribute to this goal of living those values which are shaping in the end the society and the world we all want to live in. And with these words, I would like to stop here. I wish us a very fruitful discussion. Thanks again for SAIFAC, thanks for the panelists, and thanks for your attention.
Thanks very much, Henning. I'll now hand it over to Professor Clair to get started with his presentation.
Great. Well, thank you for having me to SAIFAC. And also David, Rebecca for organizing, and Henning for that really powerful analysis and sort of introduction to the comparison and contrast between the US and South Africa. I'm looking forward to learning more about the South African case from Ottilia and Jonny especially. So my talk today is titled Racism in the US Criminal Legal System and the Necessity for Change. And so drawing on social scientific research, I'll consider how policing in the US is one feature of a broader system of racial social control under the law. And I'll also talk specifically about the movement for Black lives in the US and how the movement offers not just a critique of police violence, which has sort of been central to a lot of the journalism and analysis around the movement, but it more broadly seeks to abolish other forms of racial social control and economic exploitation of workers of color that's fundamental to racial inequality in the United States. And so before I begin, I want to first acknowledge, as we already have done to some extent, the specific tragedies and loss of life this spring and summer that have brought us here today in the US and internationally. So the state-sanctioned killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, Rayshard Brooks, and so many other Black people in the United States at the hands of police or at the hands of white civilians who felt emboldened to kill Black people, given the way that our law and US government's seeming disregard for Black lives signals to them the ability to kill Black people with impunity. And in addition to these recent deaths, there are the countless Christian Coopers of the world. And just 2 days ago, there was Jacob Blake in Wisconsin. And these are Black men who are threatened or who were physically shot at by police or civilians, but survived. And there are countless people like this whose names we do not know. People whose lives were almost taken and are continually threatened, given American society's tight association in our politics and culture between Blackness and alleged criminality. And also given everyday understandings, even among seemingly progressive and well-intentioned white Americans, such as in the Christian Cooper and Amy Cooper case. There's an assumption and an acknowledgement that our criminal legal system is inherently and explicitly supposed to be used as a way for white people to control Black people. And so these are all recent incidents, but of course these functions and killings are not new in the American context. So in 2014, there was Michael Brown in Ferguson. In 2012, there was Trayvon Martin in Florida. These were sort of the immediate moments that sort of this most recent institutional or movement and organization around the movement for Black lives and other organizations affiliated with the movement for Black lives. In the 90s, there was Amadou Diallo and Rodney King. In 1964, there was James Powell in New York. In 1955, there was Emmett Till. And so these names are quite familiar to many Americans, white, Black, Latino, Asian, Native American. And these names may also be familiar to an international audience, but just as familiar as they are, we're here again and again, despite the familiarity of the underlying problems that have caused their deaths. And so often change within the United States depends on international pressure. And American political leaders' fears of looking hypocritical when they strive to tell other nations and get into their business and tell them how to treat their own residents and citizens with dignity, respect, and justice. But in their own country, Black people, Indigenous people, and many other marginalized racial groups are not treated with the same dignity and justice that they force or are trying to force other countries to grapple with and deal with their citizens. So where and how does racism operate in the criminal legal system in the US? So I want to talk not just about how policing operates as an oppressive force, but also the broader criminal legal system, the institutions that are attached to and provide authority and legitimation for, and also depend on policing for their business. These include prosecutors' offices, court systems, prisons, and other surveilling and punitive institutions. And they also involve corporations and private legal actors and systems that depend on and use and invest in policing in order to move away marginalized populations from city districts and also from the places that they're doing business. So the president and justices of the criminal legal system emerge from a history of persistent racism within the law, as well as the explicit ways the law has been used to maintain white supremacy and racial capitalism in the US. So there's a long history here. Prior to the Civil War, slave patrols monitored and surveilled enslaved Black people. And as part of these slave patrols, white working class people were enlisted from militia to enforce white plantation owners' investment in Black people as property. And such patrols were the antecedents to modern police departments in the South. Their institutional structure was carried through to the formation of modern police departments. After the Civil War, 9 states adopted Black codes, which criminalized Black people for various things, such as just seeking to change their employment or being jobless in an unfortunate labor market. And these Black codes often did this through vagrancy laws and other types of loitering laws. 8 states adopted convict leasing laws, which allowed former plantation owners and companies to hire incarcerated people for little or no pay. And in addition to this, legislators who were concerned immediately during Reconstruction or post-Reconstruction about the potential of Black political power in the South, given the recent franchise. And so a lot of legislators enacted felony disenfranchise laws, which intentionally sought to suppress Black men's right to vote through laws that targeted Black people and constructed conceptions of crime and criminality and manufactured new conceptions of crime and criminality that didn't exist before. So the present policing crisis that we are witnessing today, along with its correlate, the mass incarceration crisis, has its roots in this racist late 19th and early 20th century history, but it was accelerated in the 1980s. So the late 70s and 80s are an important turning point, given the documented massive increase in the scale of the legal system, especially in poor communities of color in the United States. So the 1980s is the start of what I often refer to in my work as the period of mass criminalization. So you've probably heard of the term mass incarceration, which characterizes the massive and historically unprecedented use of prisons and jails in the US to punish people, not just who are convicted of crimes, but also to warehouse people who are accused of crimes or other legal violations while they're awaiting trial. And also immigrant detention centers are also counted in the rise of mass incarceration. So in 2008, incarceration rates peaked. There were 1.6 million people serving time in prison, and 2.3 million people were incarcerated in jails, prisons, and immigrant detention centers. So the rates are that in 2016, 450 of every 100,000 residents in the United States were incarcerated in state or federal prisons. And this is referred to as mass incarceration because it's unprecedented in comparison to other countries and also comparison to the US historically. So for comparison, South Africa's incarceration rate today is 259 per 100,000, which is also a high incarceration rate, but not as high as the United States. And then in 1978 in the US, so historical comparison to the US itself, the rate was 131 per 100,000. And again, this is compared to 450 now per 100,000. So over the same period of mass incarceration, the American legal system expanded beyond the prison, and that's why I speak of mass criminalization. So federal, state, and local governments shifted financial resources, not just to prisons, but also into courts, probation, and police. The growing number of public police officers far outpaced any population increases over this period, and private companies, universities, and other organizations hired their own private police forces and also collaborated with public police forces. So sociologist Louis Quicquant writes that between 1982 and 2001, the United States increased its public expenditures for police, criminal courts, and corrections by 364%, or 165% in constant dollars of 2000. And they also added nearly 1 million justice staff over that same period. So predictably, over a few decades, the number of people controlled by criminal legal institutions shot up. So today, more than 4 million people in the United States are on probation or parole, and more than 50 million people in our country have some form of contact with the police in any given year. So this can be an arrest, or it can be sort of a traffic stop, or it can be just calling police. But the number of encounters is astronomical. Thus, instead of mass incarceration, I argue that we can speak of mass criminalization, which I define as the expansion of the techniques and systems of punitive legal control across numerous institutions in the US that have a system reifying effect with one another. So mass criminalization, of course, is racialized in class, just as historically the law was used to subordinate Black people. Today, the law is used to subordinate not just poor Black people, but also Latinos and American Indian people in the US. So much so that involvement in the criminal law has become normalized in many of these communities, as sociologists describe it, meaning that it is as or more common than a college degree or a stable job. In most jurisdictions across the country, African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans are more likely than white people to be stopped by police, killed in an officer-involved shooting, arrested, convicted, and sentenced to a period of incarceration. So in 2005, the overall national incarceration rate for white people was 412 per 100,000. That's compared to 2,290 for African Americans per 100,000 and 742 for Hispanics or Latinos. So these figures mean that 2.3% of all African Americans were incarcerated, compared to 0.4% of white people and 0.7% of Hispanic people. And then this is concentrated especially at young men of color. Here the disparities are even starker. So in 2014, Black and Hispanic men aged 18 to 19 years old were respectively 10 and 3 times more likely to be imprisoned than white men of the same age. And among women, the imprisonment rate for African American women was twice the rate of the imprisonment rate for white women. And the rate of the incarceration rate of Hispanic women was 1.3 times the rate of white women. So racial disparities in the United States vary also by geography. So the United States is a huge country with completely different sort of criminal, social policy systems between states, counties, and even cities. And so racial disparities vary by geography as well as by crime type. So the type of crime being disorderly conduct, drugs, murder, whatever the alleged charge is, the disparities vary greatly. So for example, thinking about geography, in 2005, the national Black to white ratio in incarceration rates was 5.6 nationally overall. But this ranged from a high of 14 to 1 in Iowa, which is a state in the United States, to 2 to 1 in Hawaii, another of our states. So the problem is very localized in character, suggesting obviously, as I'm a sociologist, that social policy choices play a large role in explaining racial disparities. Disparities also vary across time. So over the period of mass criminalization, Black, white racial disparities in incarceration varied. So they actually peaked in 1990, and they've actually gradually declined since, even as we see more evidence visually of racial disparities. So in 1990, the relative disparity between Blacks and whites peaked at 6.8, and now it's a little bit lower. This decline, some sociologists have said it can be attributed to an increase in the number of white people who are incarcerated, revealing how the rise of mass criminalization impacts sort of people who we might think of as sort of collateral aspects of the mass incarceration phenomenon, meaning that even as the logics and motivations of the architects of the building up of prisons, jails, and police forces were often and continue to be anti-Black and exploitative of the poor and their origin, it still can have collateral consequences for non-Black people and even non-poor people. So in my research and in my forthcoming book, Privilege and Punishment, How Race and Class Matter in Criminal Court, I argue that the court system in particular, which should be a site of justice, which we think of as a check to inequality and injustice, ideally, often serves to perpetuate and legitimate the injustices that are happening at the front end in policing, and then also at the tail end in the prison. So criminal courts are the legal pathway from an arrest to a prison sentence, and they function to legitimate police through the interpretation of specific legal doctrines in the United States, which derive from our federal constitution, as well as state constitutions, such as Fourth Amendment search and seizure practices, which allow police to stop and frisk suspects for vague reasons, even though the Fourth Amendment is supposed to protect the rights of people with search and seizure. Often it's been interpreted that police have much discretion and authority. And also various laws and legal precedents make it difficult for incarcerated people to seek redress from abuse in prisons, such as abuse such as solitary confinement or sexual assault. And then also through the for-profit bail industry, which happens within the court process when someone's arrested, bail determination occurs. And this is happening in a for-profit way in the United States, unlike most other countries in the world, where here in the United States, the use of fines and fees is often used to prop up local budget revenues, as well as the use of for-profit bail helps to help private companies be able to exploit poor people of color who might have a case and can't afford to get out of jail pre-trial. So over the last several years, the movement for Black Lives has played a vital role in exposing these injustices and also shifting our national and international conversations. So I've actually been surprised by how often many people in other countries contact scholars in the United States to get a sense of what's going on, especially post-George Floyd. And so this is happening in an international phenomenon. I think it's similar to, sort of post-World War II in the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement, where the international pressure might be affecting many political leaders in the United States to some degree. So in the movement for Black Lives, there's a focus on reform proposals, but there's also increasingly a focus on abolitionist proposals. So abolition is a theory and a practice that strives toward a society where police and prisons are no longer a necessary component of the way that we deal with criminalized social harms and problems, such as substance use disorders, mental illness, or even more terrible social harm, such as assault or murder. Abolition offers not just a critique of state-perpetuated legal violence, which has been a central focus, but it more broadly also offers an alternative, which is often forgotten in many of the journalistic conversations. This alternative is a set of possibilities and imaginings of a world where we focus on prevention and reparation of social harm rather than punishment. So abolition does not just want to descale or get rid of oppressive social institutions, but it also wants to build up progressive and reparative social institutions. And so abolition has occurred in today's protests as more insistent and urgent, witnessing in particular the failures of reform over the past few years, of course under the Trump administration, but even under the Obama administration as well, when the movement for Black Lives came about. And so drawing on the work of activists such as Angela Y. Davis, Dylan Rodriguez, and others who went on to form critical resistance in Berkeley, California in the 1990s, as well as earlier prison abolitionists in the 1960s among Scandinavian activists. Drawing on their theories, today's abolitionists have articulated very specific and practical demands, what we may refer to as partial abolitions or non-reformist reforms. And these partial abolitions get us eventually to total abolition of systems of oppression. So these partial abolitions include things like defunding police, investing in non-punitive community organizations, which have been shown to be able to reduce social harm, and then also transforming the practices of existing institutions in ways that reduce their overall harm as they exist. And such efforts seek to rebuild American society from one that has historically and still is focused on racial social control and exploitation to one that's invested in the health, dignity, and humanity of Black people and other marginalized people of color. Because in the American context, the Black freedom struggle is central to any measure of true justice for everyone. So thanks so much for giving me this time today, and I look forward to hearing more from the other panelists.
Thanks very much, Professor Clair. That was excellent, really interesting and illuminating. We'll now move on to Professor Steinberg's presentation.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks, David, for inviting me. Matthew spoke of the whole criminal justice system. My talk's going to be a little narrow. It's going to focus largely on police, but there certainly are large areas of dialogue. I think what I want to do is firstly give a very brief and very potted history of what happened to policing after apartheid, and then go on to say why it turned out the way it did, and what all of that has to do with the connection between policing coercion and race. I think the first 4 or 5 years of democracy was an interregnum in policing. It was a honeymoon period. Things had not settled yet. A whole lot of stuff looked new. There was a new police uniform. There was a new police ranking system, which was now civilian and not military. There were all genuinely new relationships between police and civilians. Police now had to consult civilians in large community forums. There was also a situation where Black South Africans, for the first time in South African history, began calling police. there was, when there was an emergency, particularly domestic violence, police would be called. This was utterly new in South African history and was experienced by ordinary people as a profound change in their relation, not just to the police, but to the state. So that's some of what was happening in this very brief transitional period. Something happened of significance in 1998. There had been, as many of you know, there had been a civil war running in the KwaZulu-Natal Midlands of South Africa in the early 1990s during the transition to democracy. And in 1998, a residue of that old civil war reignited, and the police were called in. This was in the town of Richmond in southern KwaZulu-Natal Midlands. They cornered off the town and they really seized it in a paramilitary operation. They saturated it and moved in almost as an occupying army. And really, to put it bluntly, they really enjoyed doing that. There was a sense of relief because this was something that they could do, something they knew how to do, something that was in their DNA. The politics of policing and democracy was complicated, it was opaque, it was grey. This was falling back onto something that the national police machine had always done and could do. There was a palpable sense of relief in police ranks. And what happened from there was very quick. This model, this paramilitary model of dealing with systemic disorder, of dealing with incipient civil war, was generalized around the country. And what the police did is they crunched their crime stats and looked for what they called hotspots, areas where there was a lot of crime, and they went in paramilitary style. And so within 4 or 5 years, policing was looking once again pretty much as it did under apartheid. In 1999, 2000, all of this was formalized, and it was done so through, oddly enough, ironically enough, the importation of the very worst of American policing. This was a time when zero tolerance policing in New York of Bill Bratton was extremely fashionable and popular. It was said to have brought down crime rates in New York as nothing else had done before. It can't be stressed enough what a high crime society South Africa was and is, and how much fear of crime there was across the population. This looked extremely attractive, and it was brought in wholesale. The terminology, the technology, the computer software to crunch the numbers and show where the hotspots were by day of the week, by time of day. Police commanders being called to account on a month-to-month comparison of their crime statistics. Huge use of stop and search, of saturation of hotspots. The language, the techniques of American zero tolerance policing were codified and entrenched in South African policing, given the same names, given the same discourse, given the same ideology. And so a continuation of apartheid policing was in a sense, covered up by a new language, by an American language, a very unfortunate American language. And to cut a very long story short, that is the situation that we remain in today. Policing in South Africa stabilized like that in 1999, 2000, and has more or less remained that way ever since. A highly brutalized paramilitary form of policing, which goes on from one generation to the next. And the question of why things turned out that way, when during the first 4 or 5 years of transition, it seemed as if it could go another way. We have a short time and it's a complex issue, but I would give 3 brief reasons. And one is so familiar to any student of a transition to democracy, especially a transition to democracy which is looking disordered, which is looking unstable. A new regime, a new democratically elected regime comes to power, and it's juggling 2 imperatives which seem to be zero-sum, which seem that they have to choose between. And the one is a kind of a reconciliation between men in uniform with guns and civilian population. And the other is the restoration of order, and particularly the visibility of being seen to be in control of society which looks disordered. And I think that South Africa's new governors very, very much veered towards the latter. They were deeply, deeply fearful of disorder, deeply fearful of being seen not to be in control. And so here was this old tool from the past, this old instrument from the past, an apartheid instrument, which was nonetheless recognized as an instrument of stamping order on a society. It looked very attractive. It was so easy in a sense because it inherited an organization which knew how to do it. It was pretty simple to do. So that was one reason it was really from the vantage point of those exercising power, what their deepest fears were. And that was one of them. It was a runaway disorder. I mean, a second reason, and this is more complex, is that in poor communities, particularly in urban townships, survey after survey showed that there was some support for this type of policing, particularly among older people and particularly among older women. And so the first sort of systematic victim surveys done in the late 1990s showed, on the whole, people in poor areas above 40 years old were happy with policing, thought that policing was improving. If you gender those stats, it was particularly striking among women. And again, I think that one has to emphasize people's experience of violence, particularly over the last generation of apartheid. And a sense of a world being very dangerous and a craving for order. And also the fact that people didn't know of any other form of policing. You know, this was order, this was authority as people knew it. And I think people's relation to it was very complex, especially older people. And so part of what drove it was support from older people. There's a third reason, which I think is the most troubling and the most complex of all. And that is that this is a form of policing which brutalized the bodies of very particular sorts of Black people. It was young people, it was men, and it was poor people. And there's an irony. I think that when young, male, poor Black bodies are brutalized in the context of a democratic Black majority regime, and where the actual agents doing the brutalized are themselves Black, it becomes easier. In a way, in a white minority regime where the police officers are white, it is starker, it is more shocking, it is more raw. And so paradoxically, the very presence of democracy and the very presence of Black rather than white coercive agents made a very old and very nasty form of policing more acceptable. And that's part of what gives it its partial legitimacy. It's partially what gives it its staying power, what gives it its legs, and which makes the translation or the traveling of ideas from the United States to South Africa complex, which I wanted to talk about a bit more later. Well, later, I'll only speak for another 5 or 6 minutes. I want to jump from there to COVID and what happened in South Africa, which I think is striking and to me very disturbing and very alarming. You know, the lockdown was declared, and what poor urban South Africa all at once, in literally overnight, experienced was a kind of a backsliding into history. Suddenly, urban township South Africa was in the 1960s again, in an exaggerated form of the 1960s, where entire urban communities were locked in, shut down, movement utterly restricted. And the manner in which movement was policed was truly, truly primitive. You know, you had situations where young men were forced to do push-ups as punishments on sidewalks in public space. Others had to do jump squats through public space. There was an immediate militarization, a really chilling militarization of life. And I watched this happening and I thought that South Africa is going to not tolerate this. South Africa is going to rebel against this. It is unacceptable to go back to the depths of high apartheid South Africa. And, you know, I kept watching what was going on day after day and week after week. And that incipient rebellion that I thought was there, in fact, wasn't. It was much more muted than one might imagine. So first there was Collins Causa. There was, you know, the army dragging somebody from his own table and killing him. You know, which hit the news, it created great upset, but no more than that. It didn't create a movement, it didn't create mobilization, it simply drifted. Then there was George Floyd, which was in a sense more graphic, even though it happened on the other side of the world, because you could see it, because you could see that awful, awful death happening in slow motion before your eyes. And that, of course, caused a stir in South Africa. But it didn't translate into any grassroots movements, any tangible movement with force directed at what the police do, or any tangible program to contest what police do. You know, from reform to abolition, none of that really happened. it made me think that the South African populace can tolerate a great deal to an extent which I find quite disturbing. And why is that? You know, I think that some of the reasons are contingent and about circumstance and about the moment. And one of them is the great fear that the pandemic has triggered in South African society. You know, reading surveys, reading particularly the University of Johannesburg HSRC survey, which is particularly good on poor urban South Africa, I was really stunned to see, firstly, that the president's approval rating shot up during the pandemic. Second, the amount of fear people felt at the pandemic, you know, even at an early stage when it wasn't visible, when one couldn't see sick people, was very deep and very widespread. And most interesting of all is that 3/4 of respondents said that they were prepared to sacrifice human rights in order to fight the pandemic. I found that disturbing and fascinating. I think that there was deep fear. And when there is fear, I think people do accept authority, and it's the authority that they have in that moment. It's considered an emergency situation. So I think that partly we're dealing with something circumstantial, which is a widespread sense of emergency. But I also think that there's something deeper than that and something more troubling than that. You know, South Africa is a very febrile society. It's a very agitated society. People can be mobilized for all sorts of reasons. You know, there are currently literally millions of South Africans living on land that they invaded. So people can be enormously activist in large numbers and very effectively. You know, there have been protests, angry protests over shortage of housing, over poor infrastructure that has become deeply institutionalized among the South African poor. But that tradition of agitation, of febrileness, of protest does not extend to police brutality, and it hasn't even done so now. You know, at this moment where the population experienced this extreme lockdown. And I don't have clear answers to why. You know, if you told me 6 months ago that South Africa was going to suddenly be policed in this fashion, I would have been enormously surprised to discover the degree of acquiescence. And I think part of it does have to do with what I alluded to earlier, which is in a society as unequal as South Africa's, one of the things that is very unequally distributed is dignity. And that is, as much as anything else, internalized. Internalized in communities of the poor themselves. I think that there's a degree of tolerance of brutalization, which a quarter of a century into democracy, I think is disturbing, and which I think is perhaps one of the greatest manifestations of inequality that we have. An inequality that really goes into people's souls, an inequality which mutes a very human and expected response to being brutalized. So, in summary, it's a complex situation. It's South African society, as I say, which is febrile, which can get angry, which can get motivated, but not on this question. And I think that I don't have particularly good or clear answers to why, but I think getting to why opens up the society to its core and begins to answer very fundamental questions about it. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Professor Steinberg. That was really interesting and a great comparison with what Professor Clair talked about in the US. So moving on, we'll now move to Ms. Maunganidze, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. It's been fascinating listening to both Matthew and Jonny speak, one on the US perspective and then secondly on the South African one. One of the things that Matthew said that kind of stuck with me is countless people whose names we do not know are killed like this. And this was obviously first in reference to both George Floyd, but also to Breonna Taylor, and the fact that, quite frankly, there are so many more people on a daily basis, weekly, yearly basis, whose names are not catalogued. And so it ties in with what I had prepared anyway to cover. which is that one of our key challenges has been that we view and we treat racism, xeno-antagonism, which I'll touch on a bit later, as well as police brutality within both the United States and South Africa as events and incidents. So things that come and go, and things that we protest in a particular moment, and then we go back to our everyday life. And so in doing that, however unfortunate, we treat them as if they're not part of a systemic form of violence and brutality that has deep roots. When Matthew was speaking, he spoke to the history, particularly of slavery, but the continuing prison industrial complex within the United States. And when Jonny was speaking, he spoke about apartheid specifically and the lessons, terrible lessons, that we in South Africa have chosen to take and carry forward into democracy and into freedom. And so one of the things that I would like to touch on quite a bit is around how not only do we treat the violence against particularly Black people, young Black men in the United States and in South Africa as events, but also then we seek to hold people individually accountable for something that is in itself a systemic issue. And so there's no real process of reckoning at a societal or national level around the continuing of these crimes. So we can deal with it in 2020 and people protest, and they should protest. But at the same time, we recognize that this is something that can happen next year or the year after. And we don't actually do perhaps what I feel is the hard work in addressing the system of violence and brutality. Before I go into selected issues in my presentation, I thought to speak about some events that mark or tar the history of South Africa when it comes to police brutality. I'll go all the way back before I come to May 2020. So for us in South Africa, Human Rights Day that we mark on the 21st of March every year is as a result of the Sharpeville massacre in 1960. Where over 60 people were essentially brutalized by the police in protesting at the Sharpeville police station. A few years later, students in Soweto uprose protesting the unjust Bantu education system. Many died as a result at the hands of the police. And for that, in June, we commemorate Youth Day. In this month, not too long ago in 2012, minors were shot by police people in Marikana for simply protesting fair wages. These are all a range of people who, seeking some form of justice, were instead violated or brutalized by the very police meant to protect them. A man very few people know, Emidio Josias Mido Masia, was killed in 2013, a Mozambican immigrant and taxi driver killed in the custody of the police. There are so many incidents like this, and they tar our present as much as they tar our past. But again, we speak of them and we speak of the names of those people, like earlier Matthew alluded to Collins Kosa, who was killed at his home in 2020 during this current lockdown that we're experiencing for COVID-19. And so we're able to catalog them and place them within our history, almost as if these are events that happen, they pass, and we remember them, but we do not do anything to deal with them. And so in speaking this evening, I'm going to try to cover a number of issues. The first that I will deal with is the inherent violence and brutality of systemic racism. The next are the continuing legacies of apartheid within South Africa that we see manifesting not only in the police, but replicated through society. The third is the geography of police brutality, which Jonny already alluded to. And then I will speak very specifically around xeno-antagonism, or what I call the point of weakest resistance, where you seek to protest against the other within South Africa. And then what do we do? Do we seek to reform the system, or do we dismantle it altogether? And what is the place of the law in this regard? So first, in framing the inherent violence and brutality of systemic racism and why it is that young Black people are often the targets of the violence of police, even where the police themselves are Black, in South Africa in particular, because of our history that not only stratified people according to race, but then also graded them likewise. So the life of a Black person was seen as hugely inferior as to that of any other category of race. The result is, as Jonny said, that dignity becomes stratified before you even look at the racial, before you even look at the class of the person. And so we see this playing out with the police targeting particular communities. When the lockdown started here in South Africa for the COVID-19 response, my first thought, I being an upper middle income person, was that I probably would not see a soldier in my neighborhood. And to date, over the past 5 months, I have not seen a soldier in my neighborhood. I have, however, seen soldiers and police patrolling lower income neighborhoods in townships and rural communities where they already see a particular threat. And so I, as much as I'm a Black person, am protected by the fact that I am not a lower income South African, which is rather unfortunate. And this is a continuing legacy, unfortunately, of apartheid, where essentially you're able to buy freedom and buy protection even where you are Black. The next then, which is linked to this, is the geography of police brutality. Jonny alluded to essentially the boots on the ground in townships and the fact that these exist in informal settlements and they do not exist here. But I think what's more poignant is how they do not exist even in lower density business nodes, to the extent that you can actually have an experience that is completely different within the same society. And so in addressing the violence that the police commit, I think it's important for us to have a very honest reflection on where it is that this violence is meted out and against whom and against whose bodies. The next then is the xenophobia and xenoantagonism that we see manifesting within South African society and then replicated by the police. And here we see particularly African migrants, but also migrants from South Asia being the targets of this violence. This, and I bear to stress this, is not violence that is only meted out by the police, but in fact where there are community stresses, particularly in lower income areas, that the first target, so to speak, becomes the newcomer in the neighborhood. And often those are people that have recently migrated, seen themselves as being unlawful simply by being present in those spaces. And it is this that saw a person like Mido Masia in 2013 being killed by South African police in Johannesburg. He himself being a Mozambican migrant and a taxi driver, eking out what one might have imagined was an honest living, but then suffering at the hands of the police. And so I turn, as I go into concluding and hoping that we can brainstorm around some solutions. Matthew spoke around different schools of thought around what do you do? Do you defund the police or do you seek to reform it? And I think one of the things that we all almost must accept perhaps is, at least for now, that the police are a reality within our societies. But how do you ensure that the very people intended to promote safety and security and to protect the public aren't actually the ones that are committing violence against them? And there, I think, is the important lesson around, if things don't work, you do need to be able to rethink the design of a particular structure. South Africa's police service was renamed from a police force with the dawn of democracy. But from what we've heard from Jonny, unfortunately, once service became too difficult, it became easier to go back and to fall back on the use of force as mandated by the state, but often through brutal violence against citizens as a way to control and exert authority over people. And I think it is here, particularly in South Africa, where we can be able to draw on existing laws to be able to effect that kind of reform that is needed. Some of it will actually require us to dismantle some of the systems of oppression, but some of it, I feel, within our legal framework, we can be able to actually effect that reform. It is ironic that one of the older pieces of law that deal with criminal conduct, the 1977 Criminal Procedure Act, is one of the ones that South African police use the least when it comes to responding effectively to criminal conduct by individuals here in South Africa. And so even the prohibition of torture, which is contained within our Criminal Procedure Act, is often ignored. And here I do feel that it's important, and Matthew spoke about how we shouldn't view the police in isolation of a broader criminal justice system. It is important here that we draw on the role and the work of the National Prosecuting Authority, likewise the judiciary, to be able to bring the police to book. Importantly, here in South Africa also, we also ought to look and draw on the role of the Independent Police Investigative Directorate to be able to call into order police when they do act outside of the scope of their mandate. Often these are tools that are available to the public, but the public do not know about them and therefore do not use them the way that they ought to. And I think there can be a lot that is done around ensuring that the public are actually aware of the institutions that are available to them outside of the police to hold the police accountable. And it is within that we can actually begin any process of transforming the society and ensuring that the police, and I'll end on this point because I really would like for us to get into a discussion, that the police ought to serve and protect the very citizens, unfortunately, that now do not trust the police because they are using excessive force as a means to control and as a means to assert their authority. Rebecca, I'll end there.
Great, thank you so much. That was fantastic. I think there's a lot of really interesting material for us to jump into the Q&A with, and we already have a few questions. So I will read 3 at a time if that works for everyone. And if all the participants want to continue posting, I'll do them and continue to do them in batches of 3. So to start, the first question we got is for Professor Clair, and it is, which states are Black positive, and are these correlated with whether they're Democratic or Republican? Which states are the worst Black negative, and is there solidarity among minority groups in support of Black Lives Matter, specifically Latinos, Native Americans, etc.? And the second question we got is, South Africa was supposed to move to a culture of justification rather than imposition of brute authority. How do we change the very approach to authority in both societies? Are there any models worldwide of policing which panelists would see as desirable in going forward? And finally, our focus has rightly been on a comparison of the underlying causes and comparisons of the policing practices in the US and South Africa, against which the Black Lives Matter movement emerged and has had significant impact. I'd be interested to hear in Matthew and other panelists' views about the character of the protest movement itself, aside from the continued salience of the issues at stake. What do you think have been its strength? How transformative do you think social media has been in shaping the protests and of globalizing these issues? And what lessons do you think could be learned by advocates of police reform in South Africa? So I think maybe we can continue with the Q&A in the same order we presented, if that works for everyone.
So I'll answer the first question. Maybe I can answer the third as well. And then I guess the other panelists can jump in on all 3 as well. With respect to the Black positive or Black, I think they're referring to the Black-white incarceration ratio. In the United States, so actually if you look at the Sentencing Project, which is a website that collects so in the United States, we collect our incarceration statistics from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which is under the Department of Justice. And so they ask prisons and jails to submit what their populations are. And so that's what the Sentencing Project is looking at. And so I'm just gonna look now, and it looks like New Jersey right now, in the most recent data, has the highest Black-white disparity. Wisconsin's up there, Iowa, as I mentioned, is still up there. And then the lowest are places like Georgia, Mississippi, and Hawaii. And so just from a quick look, I don't see any sort of correlation between whether it's a Republican or Democratic state. I will say, generally, when we look at these incarceration rates, so there's the overall incarceration rate, and then there's the Black-white ratio. Often those things are not aligned, meaning often states that actually have low incarceration rates are states that actually have high racial disparities. And that's partly because in these states where there are lower incarceration rates, they're more finely targeting the carceral system and the police state against young Black men in particular. So the disparity there is going to be higher, whereas in other states like Georgia, I think was there on the bottom, you know, they're often so large in their carceral capacity that they're pulling in a lot of white people, so the disparity might not be as high. Whether there's solidarity, I think in the Black Lives Matter movement, and this will answer sort of the third question as well, I think there, in the movement for Black Lives has actually been pretty popular in the United States presently compared to just 5 years ago when it first started. And this popularity, I think, might be a then popularity in some sense. So often in sociology, you know, we use attitudinal surveys to look to see, you know, what's people's support for a social movement or their support for a social policy. And there is support for the slogan Black Lives Matter, but there might not be support for specific movement organizing efforts or specific policies. So for defund police, for example, I haven't looked to see if there's any support on defund police, but I bet that support is lower than the support generally for the slogan Black Lives Matter. So in the United States, there is a lot of support for Black Lives Matter, but maybe not for the specific things that the movement for Black Lives is asking for. And we can see in the current election, right? And right now the Republican National Convention is using the defund slogan as a way to sort of reinsert this law and order politics that has been part of our politics in the United States for decades, to try to scare a lot of sort of white suburban voters to think that Joe Biden, who has no interest in defunding the police, Kamala Harris, who has no interest in defunding the police as well, they're very much reformists, but they're being lumped into sort of the very progressive wing of the movement for Black Lives. And so to sort of also answer that third question, I think that the strength of the movement for Black Lives in the United States is very much centered around social media, but it's also very much centered, I think, on a legacy of the civil rights movement and drawing on the civil rights movement and the practices of the civil rights movement historically in the United States. And the fact that the United States has always sort of, you know, I think Black people in the United States have, unlike in South Africa, right, where it's a majority Black population, Black people in the United States, it's a subordinated population and group that was intentionally in the formation of our democracy, unlike in South Africa, was excluded from the democratic project, right? And so in the United States, there has been, throughout the Black freedom struggle, a grappling with that and a drawing on that reality and recognition that inherently our democracy is fundamentally flawed in a way that I'm not so, and I don't know as much about the South African case, but you know, the reinstituting of democracy post-apartheid in South Africa, I think, was trying to grapple with that explicitly in a way that in the United States that never happened.
Let me focus my remarks on the second question, on David's question, on a culture of justification and how to instill it. No, I don't think that one needs to go traveling the world looking for a model. I think all the elements are in place locally. You know, South Africa has IPID, you know, an office which is compelled by law to investigate complaints against the police. There is civil law and there's criminal law, and both work. There's the question of who has access to IPIDs, to civil law and to criminal law. It isn't people who are brutalized by the police. And so the answer really depends on local level organization and of the formation. You know, South Africa has an incredibly vibrant associational life and civil society at every level in every community, no matter how poor. And it's really a question of organizing against police brutality at a very grassroots local level. And it does happen sporadically in some places, but it's not widespread at all. It requires a kind of alliance building, a kind of a network building between all sorts of different people with different levels of resources, of access to law, of access to dignity. But it's you know, if there is NGO work to do on policing in South Africa, if there's assistance work to be done, it is giving a financial and legal infrastructure to that sort of grassroots work. So the institutions are there. It's the question of the capacity to access them.
To add to the responses that have been given, I work for the Institute for Security Studies, and one of the things that we do is actually aimed at reforming the police, and in particular ensuring that there is better policing. Often we are at loggerheads with the police around some of their actions. Recently, for example, we spoke around the things that should have happened after Marikana that didn't, including the full release of the report following the murders of the miners in Marikana. At the same time, we've also looked at what is needed, particularly in those communities most affected by police brutality. In areas, for example, like in Khayelitsha in the Western Cape, something as simple as a recommendation we made around ensuring sufficient street lighting to help people not only identify those criminals on the street, but also the police. But increasing visible policing that is not weaponized visible policing in those same communities. So recognizing, and this is something that historically has been there, including what Jonny alluded to earlier around the community policing forums, around the role, for example, of IPID. So having these mechanisms in place is perhaps not the problem. The problem, and to stress the point that Jonny made, is around ensuring that the greater public has access to this information, but also is sufficiently empowered to be able to use it. So not by way of an ad break, but essentially the work that teams at the ISS do around justice and violence prevention is aimed at hopefully doing that and partnering with a number of organizations to do that. The related point, I think, in terms of drawing lessons from other systems where their policing methods are perhaps better. I don't necessarily think that there's any country that has a perfect policing method, but I do think when it comes to, and I'll stress this point around seeing the police within your society, not as a threat, but as actually working to serve and protect the public. We've seen this a bit more prominently in parts of Germany, so not across Germany, but we have seen where they have used the visible policing as a way to ensure that people use the police rather than flee and run away from the police when they see them. So the police as protectors rather than just enforcers. On the question around Black Lives Matter, I remember earlier this year, someone asking me, you know, what is South Africa doing around Black Lives Matter? And I thought to myself, living in a country where 92% of us are Black, that every single protest that is done within South African society for service delivery, against government corruption, against some of the many stresses affecting the majority of the population, are in fact a call to recognize that Black lives do matter. It becomes difficult for a society like that to simply use it for a particular message. That being said, and I think it's ironic that countries being under lockdown, for example, and people being shuttered at home actually gave greater steam to the Black Lives movement now, Black Lives Matter movement, now, than it could have done in 2015. And it is perhaps because people were at home, frustrated and watching people across the world being in conditions that they shouldn't be in, that pushed people across the world, more in Europe than here in Africa, to go on the streets in support of that movement. And I do think social media played and continues to play a critical role. There are so many people, and I say this from a personal take, that I communicate with that in the absence of social media, I probably would not be able to communicate with, to know their particular plight. That being said, and I'm going to stress this point, it is not that South Africa or South Africans do not care for Black Lives Matter as a movement. In fact, and I'll stress this again, it is because for every single protest that is done within the South African context, particularly as it relates to fair wages, police brutality, or as was done historically for student movements such as Fees Must Fall in South Africa, a lot of those protests are inherently saying, recognize the dignity of the majority of the population, and those in South Africa are Black.
Great, thank you so much. We did get a few more questions, and I think we have time for a second round, so I get started on that. The first question is for Professor Clair, and it's, in what way are the state laws versus the federal laws affecting the movement in the US? And to what extent does partisan politics, which you touched on a little bit, direct and maintain systemic racialism in the US? Would you say that the Black Lives Matter movement exposes the illusion that the civil rights movement brought the intended liberation of Black people? And how does the construction of race contribute to the continual lynching of Black bodies? And then the second question is, in addressing the core essence of Black Lives Matter, is there a role society can play? Whilst the focus is on police brutality, is there an underlying problem within the society of undervaluing African lives in general that perhaps needs to be addressed, which is not perpetrated by the police, but only by members of the society? And Dr. Maunganidze, you touched on that a bit in what you just said, but maybe you could build off of that in responding to that question. And then I'd also like to hear a little bit more from Dr. Maunganidze and Professor Steinberg about what you think is needed to propel more movement for change in South Africa. I was interested to hear the take on what's happened in the lockdown in South Africa, and I was also surprised during the lockdown that there was less of a response and sort of rebellion to the lockdown itself and the rules around that, but then also the reports of police brutality that began emerging quite early on. So this time I thought we could go in reverse order and start with Dr. Maunganidze and move to Professor Steinberg and then to Professor Clair, if that's okay. Oh, I think we lost your...
There we go.
There we go.
No, you didn't lose my audio. I forgot to unmute myself. So on the question around the role that society can play, you know, in my presentation, I tried to get across the point that police brutality itself plays out within a society that already is either suffering from or attempting to heal from systemic violence and brutality. And I think reforming only the police or attempting to reform only the police without doing which I feel is the hard work of changing societal perceptions as they relate to police violence or the role of the police within society, simply means you will get a minor win and not the total win. There is so much that can be said and done by society to be able to effect that kind of, and the level of change. I will say, and Rebecca, you asked this question now around the way in which people didn't react perhaps as strongly as they should have to something such as the murder of Collins Khosa, even though now we are seeing efforts towards accountability. In particular, thanks to the military ombudsperson, in fact, who found that the military acted outside the bounds of the law, right? And so for me, seeing the violence on the one hand, it's unfortunate, but the violence was expected. I remember on the 25th of March when the president then did the formal and official deployment of the military in support of the police, monitoring Twitter to see people's reactions. And a lot of people were saying, oh goodness, stay at home, because the police and the military have now been given this authority to overexert their power. While at the same time, and I kept going back and referring back both to the Defense Act, but also the South African Police Service Act, which in fact don't authorize the excessive use of force, and which is why those constitutional bodies that are there to protect us against the excesses of the police are often underutilized. It is here where the particular role of civil society, of the media, but also of other institutions within the state should come into play. And I think one of the things that we've ignored perhaps in why it is that people were so comfortable, let me say it, to be under lockdown, it is because the lockdown was in response or is in response to a health pandemic. Had the lockdown been imposed under any other condition, as has been the case when lockdowns have been imposed in parts of Cape Town in response to gang violence, you see greater resistance to that because it is attempts to change the way in which we work without them recognizing that this is a threat to greater society. When you say that the lockdown is in response to a threat to all of us, it becomes easier for people to accept the removal of certain of their freedoms. That being said, a 73%, which is what the Human Sciences Research Council found, a 73% compliance with lockdown regulations, while they felt it was not high enough, to me is extremely high considering, and I bear to repeat this, the level of mistrust that exists within society towards the police in particular. I'll end there.
Thanks very much. That was great.
I think that's a crucial point. I want to try and just nibble at the question of what would a Black Lives Matter program mean in the South African context? And, Matthew kept stressing that police brutality should not be isolated from systemic exclusion economically, socially. It shouldn't be bracketed off. My concern in the South African context is that there is such enormous disparity of experience within Black South Africa that a Black Lives Matter program would end up being appropriated by some and suppress the voices of others. And, Black middle-class people in South Africa face enormous oppression, enormous problems. We had a negotiated settlement which left intact white control of corporations, of professions, of vast tracts of the economy. Being Black and middle class is dealing with all of that. Means going to universities whose structures remain the same and whose ethos remained the same. So many of the issues around race in South Africa are precisely because Black middle class people have the real burning issues that they have faced. But they are not the same as being locked down in informal settlements by paramilitary occupation. That is something else. And I'm wondering how both of those experiences and both of those exigencies get rolled into the same movements and whether they can. And that makes me a little cautious and perhaps a little skeptical about how ideas can and should travel. I think that they need to be interpreted very carefully once they've traveled. And that local and national conditions need to be understood at every moment.
Yeah, it's interesting to make the comparison. In the United States, the slogan and the idea of Black Lives Matter is really actually thinking about the majority of Black lives in the United States that are, concentrated, segregated in cities that have environmental pollution, that don't have good schools and housing. And, there is a slim majority of Black elites and Black middle class, probably the ones who are most known outside the US, Beyonce and Obama and, and it's interesting because their politics is a very reformist politics, but at the same time, there is in the United States, because race is so tightly located and centralized sort of stereotypically as poverty, and Blackness is sort of stereotyped as poverty, whereas in South Africa, that's not necessarily the case because there seems to be, or there's a presentation of a more diversity of the Black experience. In the United States, driving down the street as a Black person, the first thought is, you don't belong here. Even if you are living in the house right down the street in a huge house, right in a well-off neighborhood, the assumption is Blackness is associated with poverty in the US. And that's why I think the Black Lives Matter movement, even though there is a middle-class contingency in the United States of Black people, has been able to collectively organize around Blackness as sort of the primary axis of differentiation and stigmatization and oppression. In answer to the questions about the state versus federal and sort of the imagination of the legal framework in the United States post the Civil Rights Movement, I really want to sort of tag on what Ottilia said in her earlier remarks, sort of about the possibilities of the legal framework and not sort of abandoning them. In the United States, I think the Constitution has always been an aspiration and ideal, even though it inherently excluded Black people and enslaved Black people in particular. There were the Reconstruction Amendments. There was a process of an attempt for Reconstruction right after the Civil War. Of course, it was squashed and it didn't fulfill itself. And then the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s was supposed to bring that about again. But then there's always this, as the question asks, right? There's always this move in partisan politics in the United States. There's, you know, a progressive move, and then there's a sort of conservative backlash. And we see that sort of at the, if we think about the legal framework, not just in politics, but if we think about it sort of at the constitutional level or legal doctrine and how the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution. We saw in, you know, the sort of middle of the 20th century in the United States, there was the Warren Court, which was sort of led by a sort of progressive liberal justice, expanding rights for legal or for criminal defendants and for Black people in various ways, and using the 14th Amendment in ways that expanded rights for Black people. And then you sort of had the conservative backlash of the Burger Court. So the United States legal framework is always up for interpretation, and that's part of the struggle, I think, in the United States, is how are we interpreting this legal document and contrasting explanations of how we should think about what does true justice and equality look like. And so, yes, there was an allusion to the Civil Rights Movement, but I think the Civil Rights Movement sort of had a backlash less than, it's not necessarily that the legal framework itself is insufficient, it's that it's not being interpreted in a way that's expansive of rights in the current moment. And then the sort of state law versus federal law question, you know, I think it is definitely affecting the movement in the fact that because the United States is such a big country, because there are just so many different political levels that have effects for people's lives, there are various ways that the movement is sort of pushing different pressure points in a world where we have a federal government that is very punitive, that has drawn and pushed itself in that direction, that has is looking at a movement against racist police violence and is responding, saying that we need more of it. And so what is happening sort of at the state and local level is a lot of organizers are trying to elect progressive prosecutors, trying to elect judges at the local level and at the state level, trying to go to their city council and defund their specific police forces and departments. But at the same time, we also see how, because the federal government exists, the federal government has its own police force, right? So, you know, the protests in Portland, Oregon, you may have seen, where we see there are these protests against racist police violence. There's maybe some agreement among the mayor that, yes, policing has gone too far, but then federal troops are pushed in. And that, first of all, there's a police force there that's legitimate to be there because there are federal buildings there, and so they have legitimate justification to be there and protect a federal property. And so the tension there between the state and the federal government is really problematic in many ways in the United States, and I think is a fundamental issue that we have to grapple with as we think about moving the movement forward, and we think about the successes in local areas, and then also having to push for successes at the federal level as well.
Great, thanks so much. I'd love to continue, but I think that's all we have time for today. So I want to move on to concluding. We did get one question coming through that maybe for our South African panelists that maybe you can address in your concluding remarks, which is highlighting that you haven't really fully fleshed out with the lack of leadership in the South African context, and specifically the Minister of the Defense Force playing down the brutality of the army and how that might impact the idea that the police or army can get away with brutality without accountability. For concluding remarks, I was hoping each of you could maybe talk about the US and South Africa comparison and whether you think that this is a fruitful comparison and what kind of broad themes can be drawn from this discussion. And specifically, we also had a question about, from the presentations, it seems that Professor Clair is more favorable to the abolition approaches, and the South African panelists are more favorable to reformist approaches, and querying whether this says anything about the social movements in the two societies and or represents a difference between the approaches to social change in the US and South Africa. So maybe we can, to conclude, go back to the original order, starting with Professor Clair.
So yeah, I think this has been a very fruitful comparison and dialogue. And I will say, just as, you know, an American scholar, we often in the United States do not look beyond. And it's really frustrating, actually, for many scholars in the United States who maybe come from other countries, but also for American scholars, because I think there are other models and possibilities of arrangements of systems outside of the United States. And so for me, this conversation has been very fruitful in understanding and considering why the movement for Black Lives is so focused in the United States and so able to continually have a presence around getting Black people sort of on the same page, even despite sort of the increasing diversity among Black people with respect to class post the civil rights movement. And understanding how Black Lives Matter, sort of as Jonny was saying, may not be transportable or able to be imported to other countries who have very specific sort of histories of racism, but then also very specific problems that they're grappling with. I think in the United States, the beauty of the movement for Black Lives is there's this understanding that when Black people have freedom, everyone is free. And that's because Black people have historically and still are at the very bottom of the racial order. And that comes along with economic and social inequality, sort of fundamental social inequality issues around economics, poverty, access to education and resources. And so I think, you know, thinking about the South African cases, Ottilia and Jonny have already said, I think really being specific about class is super important in the South African context, and maybe having a class movement is maybe more salient and possible than a race sort of movement that subordinates and sort of marginalizes the most marginalized in the group for maybe people who are economically advantaged within the racial group. So it's been a really helpful comparison for me. And I think the abolitionist, just to answer David's question, the abolitionist approach, I guess, in the United States is gaining a lot of steam and possibility. And that's partly because it's so clear that police is centrally targeted against Black people and Black lives. Whereas in South Africa, it seems that policing has other priorities and possibilities, even when it's targeted at young people and people in poverty. I think in the United States, the Black Lives Matter movement has just understood that this is just unsustainable, and that violence in the United States is not just a problem of community violence, it's very much a problem of police violence. There's some statistics that suggest that about 6% of murders in the United States or deaths in the United States can be attributed to policing. We have more than 1,000 people killed by the police every year in the United States. It's just unsustainable, and there's a better possibility of approaches because the current way is just not working.
Yeah, Matthew, I also learned a great deal. And just looking from afar at the United States, in a way, the existence and the power of the abolitionist movement seems obvious. You know, when so many state services are being cut and police expenditure goes up and up and up, and it's all trained on Black communities, you can absolutely see where the politics of abolition comes from. You can see where it gets its energy from. How that translates to South Africa, in addition to the cautions that you've raised, you know, I think the possibility of abolition really depends on a pretty complex and sophisticated set of public institutions that could play the role that policing has been playing. It's a very delicate set of substitutions. In South African townships, you know, there are social agencies that do pretty well, especially cash transfer agencies, which are absolutely crucial for the poor. Whether the sorts of agencies that are going to substitute for policing can do so in the context of a South African township is really up for grabs. It's really open to question. And an abolition movement could end up just unraveling state services. So it's a tentative point, but it is about a deep and careful focus on the institutions that exist at a local level and what is possible. What sort of institutional journeys can be experimented with and can happen?
For me, the comparison or even the equivalence, so to speak, of the histories of the United States and South Africa, it almost goes without saying. And for me, it's simple. Oppression is oppression is oppression, regardless of where it is and how it plays out. The result is that for South Africans or even for Americans, where you see something that you experience at home that resonates with your daily experience, it's easy for you to be able to support it or to work along the same fashion. That being said, we are countries that are at different points in our history. South Africa is, in many regards, still a society in transition. We've only just hit a generation since apartheid, which means perhaps the appetite for transformative approaches or reformist approaches is there over abolition of the new system, so to speak. That's not to say that we couldn't do better in funding education, social delivery, for example. We should and we ought to. And we ought to find ways that we can be able to draw positive lessons from other jurisdictions, not only negative lessons. The other thing that I thought is worth pointing is that for South Africa, our per capita police representation is far lower than the United States. So when we speak about even visible policing, for example, it's looking at a far smaller police contingent and recognizing the split between our South African police service and our metropolitan police departments as well, and the role that they play. But the one thing that we haven't spoken about in this conversation that South Africa has more of than the police is actually private security. So private security companies employ more people, and these are people that also have the access to weaponry and the use of force. And this is a broader discussion that I think perhaps we can have at a later stage. What I would like to say, in conclusion really, is I do think we need to recognize the impact that systemic racism plays in both societies. And that, for me, is what needs to be dismantled. We can deal with the issues around reforming and even defunding the police. But fundamentally, if we do not address the reason it is that police in both societies feel it so much easier to target Black people, we haven't dealt with the problem. Something else will prop up. And that is something that we need to be able to address. And that is a whole of society approach to dealing with it. It's not enough for the state alone to be responsible for the kind of change that is needed across these societies. On the issue around leadership, I cannot underline this enough. We need strong, competent, effective leadership, not only in our security forces or in our security services. We need it across the board. We need it more so in our civilian components, the ones that are meant to hold to account the military and the police. If we don't have a strong judiciary, if we don't have a strong prosecuting authority, but importantly, if we don't have strong civil society that calls these entities to account, they can continue in a way that does not serve society. And so leadership should not only be for those that we are complaining about, we also ought to be able and should insist on great leadership on those that are supposed to be the checks and balances within a system that ensures good governance and proper rule of law within our societies. Sorry, we're now over 7 o'clock, so I'll end there.
No problem. Thanks so much. And thank you to everyone. This has been, in my opinion, as well, a really interesting and fruitful discussion. As an American who's now been living in South Africa for a few years, my experiences in both countries certainly, increasingly, especially more recently, has informed my perspective on what's needed and how to respond to recent developments in both the US and South Africa. So I'm glad that others also found this conversation helpful and enlightening. I want to thank all of our panelists for your excellent presentations. This was really great, and I hope we can continue these sort of comparative discussions. I also, like Professor Clair, think Americans often tend to look inwards, and it's really exciting to sort of challenge some of those perspectives and traditional ways of looking at our country. So it's excellent to do this sort of cross-cultural communication. So thank you all so much. I'll let everyone get back to their days or evenings, depending whether you're in California or South Africa or somewhere in between. And yes, thank you again, and thank you to everyone who joined us.
Thank you very much, everyone. Please, if you would like to post any messages of thank you, we would appreciate that, or jazz hands. Very, very grateful to our panelists and also to Rebecca. Thank you very, very much, and look forward to continuing these important conversations. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.